Hi, this is Talking the Whiz Quiz, an HR guide to drug and alcohol testing. I am Gary Ashman, and I have Gary Ashman here with us. Today we're going to be talking about the drug test collection process. Many don't realize that there is a standardized way to do drug and alcohol testing collections. And today we're going to go through that process and talk about the reasons why it's important that as HR or company representatives that you know how that process works. The collection process is that starting point of a good chain of custody process, ensuring the integrity of the testing and directly linking the final results of a test directly back to the donor that provided that specimen.
Most of the challenges of drug testing centers around the collection process, and it is the most likely link in the chain of custody process that an error was made or a step was missed.
The federal drug testing regulations, 49 CFR Part 40, and the U.S. DOT urine specimen collection guidelines is the standard for both federal and non-regulated urine test collection procedures, and that is the standard that most drug testing centers will use in that process. Urine specimen collection technicians must meet the training and certification requirements of the 49 CFR Part 40 requirements, and including completion of mock collections prior to being allowed to collect a federal drug test. Mock collections are just what that sounds like. It's testing or going through certain scenarios in tests that may occur in a real test situation.
That includes both a non-eventful event, but also some of the problem collections that they are going through. And obviously, we want to put a collector who is in training, who's just learning that process. We want to put them through these scenarios before they're actually doing the, on their first live subjects. Once we even, as part of that process, once we even have them do that and go through and get them certified, we also have, that trainer and supervisor monitor them, over their first, several collections, just to make sure they are continuing to do that. And, and also, we're always continuing to monitor our collectors, processes to always make sure they are confirming. As Lori said, the federal government has standardized the testing requirements for federal collections, which includes the U.S. Department of Transportation, but that is the gold standard we do use for non-regulated testing too.
Right. And the reason that has become the gold standard is it is good practices. And we're going to go through all of those steps of that collection process today and kind of talk through what implications when things may or may not be done correctly. Gary mentioned an uneventful versus a problem situation. We'll go through a lot of that as well. Uneventful means just that. It's everything goes exactly how it's supposed to. And I will say, a good majority of tests are uneventful. But there are situations when things happen through that testing process that decisions have to be made in how to proceed. So we'll go through all of that. Best practices. There is a best practice also for the designated employer representative of the company. You need to know and familiarize yourself with those collection requirements so that you can monitor and serve your service vendors and also be able to discuss collections concerns with your employees or applicants and also with those collectors or your TPA. You have to understand what the process is in order to know if everything was, done correctly.
And that is extremely important because, one, as a DER of the company, you are ultimately responsible for your service providers. You do have the ability to audit and monitor your collection sites. But to do that, you need to know what those standard procedures are. And also, I've been doing drug testing collections for 35 years now. We have lots of collectors that we're having to look at, and of course, we're constantly talking with the DERs, and it's amazing that because the donors are going back to their DERs, their employers, their supervisors saying, hey, the collection site did this, and this. And they're almost complaining that saying maybe it's being done wrong, but the answer is no. There actually is a procedure, and we actually have to be able to explain that this is how we are required to do it, but also we need to make sure the DER understands those are the requirements. So that's part of the reason it's really very important to know what those procedures are. So when you are discussing something with your employees or your applicants, you can say, no, that was actually done right, or hey, I do have there is a legitimate concern here.
Right. So let's kind of dig into just testing in general. There are 3 types, and primarily we are going to talk today about urine collections. This is, when we're talking drug test collections, that is the area that we are talking about today predominantly, is going to be urine collections. That is the requirement at this time for the regulated sector for Department of Transportation. So that's why we're going to put that focus on that. So there are 3 types of urine collections. There's an unobserved test. That's going to be your regular test where the employee will go into, or the donor will go into the restroom by themselves, provide the specimen, bring it out, and continue the collection process. Then there's a monitored collection.
And a monitored collection is that the collector is actually walking in the restroom with the employee, but they're not going into the stall with the employee. We really use monitored collections a lot, especially in on-site situations where we're not using the restrooms at our facilities. We are actually at our clients' facilities. So what a monitored collection is I'm basically, as the collector, I'm probably standing by the sink, with all the paperwork, where we're kind of getting out of the view of the rest of the staff. But the donor is not being directly observed. They are in the stall by themselves. So we're not watching, we're really not watching anything private. But one of the requirements for a monitored collection, though, is the collector either has to be of the same gender as that donor, or that the collector has to be a licensed medical personnel in the state that the collection occurred in. So if I was a licensed nurse in Arizona, I could do a monitored collection on somebody of the opposite gender in the state of Arizona. I can't go, to a different state and do that. But monitor really is, we are not directly observing it, but we are in that same restroom, and it's a very convenient thing. I said, especially in an environment where you are doing it on-site, and sometimes especially in a multi-stall restroom.
Right.
Where we do not necessarily want to have to be able to secure every single stall, and then also that we can monitor any access into that restroom, and that we also sometimes, generally, a lot of times, will have a flat surface to work off of because we may have that sink area and it's actually keeping everything into that contained environment from so other employees in that facility that are walking outside of that restroom are not necessarily seeing somebody's urine being brought out.
Right. Right. And then the final kind of type of urine testing is that direct observed. In that situation, the collector is actually going into the restroom stall with that donor and visibly watching them provide that specimen. There are specific situations when that type of direct observation is used, and we'll go into that a little bit more as we go through our testing. But it is where the collector is actually watching that entire process.
It is, and we're going to talk a little bit later on about what that entire direct observation process is going to look like, and also some of the scenarios that are going to require a specimen to be directly observed.
Right, because there are very specific situations where a collector is allowed to observe that test.
And not just allowed, but required.
Right. But there are other times when they really aren't allowed to have it be a direct observe. So there are, again, we'll go through all of that as we get deeper into these steps. So the federal urine specimen collection requirements dictate that there are 25 steps. This is not an easy process that each of our collectors must go through for that urine drug test collection process. All the steps must be completed in order that the DOT dictates. So we're going to kind of dive into what those steps are. And Gary, do you want to start with that first step?
So we're going to talk about these steps and and sometimes in some of the things behind those steps too. So that one of the first steps we're going to do is we're going to inspect that collection site for security and contaminants. What that basically means is before that we ever send that donor into that restroom or into that stall, we need to make sure there are certain things that have happened. One, we have to secure all sources of water or otherwise make them unavailable to employees. What that possibly means is that we are basically walking in. If there's a sink in that restroom, I have to make it so that person cannot turn that water on or be able to access water while they are in that restroom by themselves. How we do that is, one, do we have the ability to turn the water off?
Right.
If we do not have the ability to turn it off, can I, sometimes whether we're using tamper tape to take that, to take the faucet and tape it down where if somebody turns either they cannot turn the handle on or, without breaking the tape, or do we we're covering up the tap. So if somebody does try to turn it on, all it does is spurt water at them. What I train my collectors to do is basically take one of our gloves, put it over the end of that sink, and then wrap it with security tape very securely. That way, if somebody tries to turn the water on, all the water does is just try to blow up the glove. But by doing it this way, we also are not leaving a tape residue on the faucets of our clients.
Right. And that's in the case of an on-site type collection. But in most testing facilities, you're going to find either the restroom area that the donor is going into does not have a sink, or if it does, all access to water for that sink has typically been turned off and shut down, and those other types of methods have been done as far as blocking off access to water in that area.
So that's something very important because I said when I'm monitoring, collection sites, there's many times I've walked in and okay, there's a sink here. All my facilities we've basically removed we either have built the facility, the bathroom so there's no sinks in them, or the sinks have actually been removed out of those
areas.
Out of those areas where our sink is external to the
that restroom stall.
Yeah, to where the toilet is. Second thing we do is ensure that the water in that toilet and tank, if there is a tank on that toilet, has a bluing agent in it. Basically, we want that if somebody does want to try to dip their specimen cup into that toilet, we're going to know, because now we have we have blue water in there. So that person, if they try to dip it, a few things are going to happen. One, it's going to they're going to bring out a specimen that's either going to look blue or green in color.
Right.
Or it's also, we are checking we'll talk about in a little bit, we check the temperature of a specimen, and that could possibly alter the temperature of that, of that. But basically, we are coloring that water blue, and then also we are making sure that the tanks are somehow secured shut, whether it by a tamper-evident tape, whether we can put a lock on it, just to make sure that somebody cannot, both get in, into that tank to either try to dip cleaner water out of there, or also that somebody else did not, their buddy who went earlier than them did not try to hide a specimen in that tank for them to come back to later.
Which does kind of bring up another part in securing that area, is we are also removing access to anything where either a earlier specimen could have been hidden, or where a donor would be able to dispose of any type of bottle or the like that they would have brought in with them.
Exactly. So that's certain things we're looking for. Is we're going to ensure that there's no soap accessible to them. Whether if there's a removable soap dispenser, we're going to take it out, make sure it's not in that restroom. If we cannot remove that soap dispenser, then we are going to tape it off with some type of tamper tape so they cannot use that soap dispenser. We're going to make sure there's any disinfectants, cleaning agents, other possible adulterants are getting removed out of there. Obviously, when you're sending somebody into a regular collection site, all the stuff is generally removed. It's a very barren environment. When we go into an on-site environment, especially at a customer, it's amazing where everybody, I think, uses their restrooms as storage areas. And that's where we generally have to go in before we start that collection and make sure we are really removing off all of those possible things. The other thing we're also doing is inspecting that site to ensure there's no foreign or authorized substances are present in there. One thing I always have to look at when I walk into a restroom, especially at on an on-site, is there a drop ceiling there? Most restrooms should have a solid ceiling, but there's times I walk into restrooms and there's a drop ceiling in there. And if there's a drop ceiling in there, I have to then take a tamper tape and I have to secure off every one of those panels. Right. Like I said, we have, we own 6 collection sites right now. And we're growing, and even where we've moved facilities, one thing I do when I'm looking at a new facility is first thing I do is I look up in the restroom, and if there's a drop ceiling in there, I basically tell our contractor, you need to
needs to be
into a solid ceiling. Right. So we literally have built facilities around the DOT regulations.
Right. And we're not unusual in that there are other testing facilities that are doing these same things. That this is, again, because these are federal requirements, any collection site that is doing federal tests needs to be following these guidelines. Additionally, kind of in talking of these, securing these areas, is we also need to make sure that there aren't any other types of access points to that restroom. That could mean another door, windows, anything like that. We need to make sure, again, that those access points are secured.
Yeah, which is part of the reason sometimes I said if we're doing an on-site, we'll sometimes do a monitored collection when possible, because there is, because then we do have that better ability to make sure that there is no undetected access in there, in case all of a sudden we do find, that there is a door or a window. We can better do that. But plus also, I've also told clients, if I've on sites, I go, this restroom is just not acceptable. What else do you have here? But
right.
But it's something too that you should be monitoring your collection sites, because I have walked into collections supposed to be professional collection sites, and they're not compliant. So some of the things we are looking at, I said, is we got to make sure, like I said, there's no undetected access. We're also securing areas and items such as ledges, trash receptacles, paper towel dispensers, under sink areas. We've gone in, and is there anything, that somebody, their buddy hid something before them underneath it. Like I said, I talked about before, drop ceilings. Is there anything that appears suitable for concealing contaminants? Also kind of even just a practice where, my facilities, they all have multiple restrooms. I've had times when somebody's, they come in and their child was with them and their child has to go to that bathroom so bad, okay, well, you can use that restroom, but when it's time to do the person who actually need to do the test, I would then purposely send them to a different bathroom.
Right.
Just to make sure that that they weren't trying to use their child to try to hide something. Plus, we are inspecting, once that child walks out of that restroom, I'm inspecting that restroom one more time.
Exactly.
And then, I said, we got to make sure that collection contains, if there contains any type of storage cabinet, you either need to secure it with a tamper-evident tape or padlock it off. As I said before, when we walk into doing when we've walked into doing on-site using a client's facilities, that is something that it's very common that we find a storage cabinet in the restroom that somebody's storing all their cleaning supplies with, or that we are seeing, that they have under sink cabinets.
Right.
And then we are having to, generally we're either emptying them all out, or like I said, we are using some type of tamper tape to make sure that if somebody just try to open them up, that we are going to know when we do a post-collection inspection of that facility. Which kind of actually gets us into, some things we do look at. Like I said, for on-site testing, is the collection company that you're utilizing, are they utilizing your restrooms, or are they bringing a self-contained collection truck? We own a fleet of custom trucks and trailers that we've had built for
drug testing,
drug test collections that meet the federal requirements. The benefit of those trucks is I can pull right into that client's office, right into their yard, right into their construction site. I am not having to go worry about how much securing I need to do, because I already have that restroom's already been secured in advance. It's been built specifically so it does not have items that are going to be adulterated, or areas to hide a specimen. Right. That by doing this, I can literally pull into a site and be testing that client's employees
Almost
almost
immediately.
within minutes of pulling in there. But there's times we can't do that. We have to use somebody's restroom. Plus, there's also a lot of on-site companies, they do not have those self-contained trucks. They are utilizing your restrooms. But if they are using your restrooms, are they properly securing them to meet those requirements? Are they locked down so other employees or the public cannot access the restroom while that collection process is going on? Including no one should be accessing the restroom even in between collections. Once I set up that, if I'm testing multiple people on the site, that restroom should be exclusive for my testing. You cannot be allowing other employees to say, okay, hey, I need to go now. I know you're done with that. Or be walking in the middle of a collection. That is not permissible.
Right.
And then, we need to look at, when I'm going in to secure somebody's restroom, I have to use tamper evident tape. I need to secure that thing. And is your on-site company going to leave a nice little security tape residue on your fixtures when they leave? We try to do the steps to where we can minimize that. That's what I kind of talked about before. Like on the faucet, where I'll put a glove and then I'll wrap the glove with that tape really tightly, so I'm not putting the residue on the fixture. It's on the glove. It's really all the sticky surfaces on that glove. But if they do try to turn that faucet on, they're not going to be able to. They're not going to get water coming out of it. So there's definitely, as I said, that's part of the reason we've actually spent a lot of money buying, and customizing self-contained trucks because of the advantages to our clients of that. But we also know that there's times I cannot bring our mobile trucks out there. We service a lot of, like in Arizona, I service a lot of the prisons. And trust me, the prisons do not want us to be bringing a trailer with us or a van with us. Or sometimes it's just, what is that environment? So sometimes it is, can we bring that self-contained truck or not?
Right. And I think the key here to remember is as an employer, you need to know, do I have adequate facilities to do an on-site? And when I send my employees to a collection site, are they set up properly? So, in this first step, it's really making sure that the restroom facilities that are going to be being used meet all of the requirements of not having access to water, contaminants, to, hidden storage areas, anything like that could create an issue within that testing chain of custody process.
Yes. And then, like I said, you need to be, aware of who your collection sites are. Make sure that collection site you're using does not use a shared restroom with other tenants. That sounds funny, but I have literally walked into a, drug test collection company, and they were sharing their restroom with other tenants. And because of that, they could not properly secure that restroom. They cannot just say, hey, you're the only one who has access into here. And when we saw that, we're like, yeah, that, we cannot utilize these people's business, this collection site, because that was compromising our chain of custody procedures. And then also, are they properly securing their restrooms? Are the sinks in the are there sinks in the restrooms? If so, how are they being, secured? So those are things that need to be looked at. And I will tell you that, collection facilities can be and are audited by the different federal agencies. We definitely see some agencies more aggressive than others. Federal Aviation Administration, Federal Transit Administration, the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Services Administration, we do see their auditors on a more regular basis.
Right.
And they can write up a collection facility. And some of these inspections they do are not even announced. There are even sometimes that they will do in basically called in clandestine audit, where they don't even tell you that they were there. You get a letter in the mail a month or two later saying, oh, by the way, at some point in the last couple months, we audited your facilities and these are our findings. Please respond. They will not tell you, and there'll be no detail in there. They will not tell you what day they showed up. They will just tell you, who the collector was. They will just tell you what their findings were. But also several times they are announced. We don't see the Federal Motor Carrier auditors auditing collection sites as frequently as we do some of the other agencies. But definitely the other agencies we definitely see. So they will point out, hey, there's ones that do it right, and there's ones that that are not doing it right. Fortunately, all the auditors we've dealt with basically say, hey, you guys are are some of the best out there, and we're not really finding much in the way of things to bring up.
Right. So again, that first step in this process is making sure that the restroom that is being utilized is secured, free of contaminants, and everything is in place to ensure a quality collection process. So as we go into step 2, it's the collector begins the collection process without delay after the donor arrives at the collection site. They do not wait because the donor is not ready or states that he or she does not have to urinate.
So the importance of that is when somebody does need to make an attempt, and they need to make it as soon as they are called.
Right.
As soon as they are called up. So we basically say, yes, you need to, somebody walks in and say, hey, I don't need to go right now. Well, you need to make an attempt.
Right.
And the importance of that is a fewfold. One, that most people who say they can't go, they're not feeling it, honestly can. If we ask them, because we basically need 45 milliliters of urine for a federal split sample test. Most people can give us 45 milliliters. But the other part of that is that if we do get into, and we'll talk about in a little bit, shy bladder procedures, there is a time frame on that. And we can't start that time clock until that person's first attempt. Because our time clock's not from the time they walked in the door, it's from the time they made that first attempt. So we need to have them make that first attempt so we can make sure that they are actually getting back to their job on a timely basis, or that we're not putting that collection site into a situation that person's having to stay overtime because we have to allot a certain amount of time, and if somebody's walking in late afternoon, we have to give somebody that minimum amount of time. But also, it's also from the integrity of that specimen that we do need to make sure. Now, if I have a group of people walking at one time, I'm probably going to take some of the people who are showing the signs that they need to go a little bit quicker. But we also this is also a time that we as a collector may actually kind of observe somebody, because we do find a lot of people trying to adulterate or basically bring in a fake sample with them that's not sample that's not theirs. So this actually kind of gives us a chance to, observe the donor, see if when they are coming in, when they're coming in the door and while they're in the lobby, see if there's any signs the donor may be bringing in that specimen. Are they trying to rush us a little too much?
Or are they trying to slow us down? Because it really goes both ways. Are they trying to get in and get out really fast, or are they trying to slow it down, and because maybe the specimen that they are bringing in is hotter than they know it needs to be?
Yeah. So we do, temperature. We'll talk about in a little bit that temperature is a guide, and the specimen has to be within a proper temperature range. So we want to make sure that, so some people are walking the door and they're like, okay, I want to go right now because, they know they want to get it before it cools down.
Right.
Or like I said, it's, I kind of, always say to a few of my, to people, this sounds a little wrong, but, never use the microwave. Never use a microwave at a convenience store anywhere
near a drug testing
facility because you don't know what was in that microwave just before
right.
Before
you're using it.
You're trying to use it. But we also are kind of looking, are people making unusual adjustments to themselves? Unusual gait indicating they're trying to conceal, secure, fake specimen. I have literally had donors drop their fake specimen in the middle of my lobby. I remember one time, one of our other donors in our facility came up to one of our collectors and said, "Hey, somebody just dropped something in the middle of the lobby. That was urine." Like, okay, and fortunately, I have security cameras in our lobby. We have security cameras outside of our restrooms, and so we can go back and look at things. And before this person we allowed this person to give a sample, I pulled up the security cameras. Noticed that yes, this person walked in our office, signed in. Then as they're walking back to take a seat, all of a sudden, a bag containing a yellow substance was dropped in the middle of our lobby. The person didn't even realize they dropped it. And he sat down. About a minute later, he looks up, sees his specimen that he brought in with him sitting in the middle of the floor. He kind of tries to stealthily, reach over, grabs it, and then he runs out of my lobby, and then a few minutes later comes back in. By that point, since this was already brought to our attention, at that point, it was determined that person needed a direct observed test.
Right.
And I've had, sometimes I'm walking out of my office, say at lunchtime, and I'm in a parking lot and I see somebody, trying to pee in my parking lot into a container and handing it off to their friend. There's times I've called up, I just go call my staff and said, "Oh, by the way, you may need to do a direct observed on this. This is what I just saw while I was out in the parking lot."
Right.
But it is amazing. We do catch a lot of people on a regular basis trying to just looking at the signs and symptoms, the little signs of them, the little tales that are telling us, maybe we need to look at this person a little bit closer.
I think the key in this step 2 is for donors and employers to know that collection process starts immediately upon arrival at the collection facility. The employees and the everyone at that facility, they are monitoring and keeping an eye on donors from the minute you walk in the door. And your actions can be, determined, cause things to happen with that collection process.
It could be a cause for a direct observation.
Right. So the point here is that, from the time that you walk in and are signing in and are sitting in the lobby or while you are being brought back, all of your mannerisms and things that are happening during that time are being observed and are part of the collection process. So while we'll say that the collection process starts when you are brought back for the collection, in reality, it really starts from the moment that you walk in the door. When you sign in, your process has started. Yeah.
So there's a couple things we need to look at here. One, that as soon as you walk into that lobby, the collection process has not started until you have actually gotten called back. That is the technical point that the collection process. So in a pre-employment situation, if somebody leaves our lobby before they were ever called back, that's not considered a refusal to test. But in cases such as a post-accident situation, a reasonable suspicion situation, a random situation, that donor is required to stay at that collection facility until they provide a specimen. But then once we call that person back, they have to make that attempt. If they do not make an attempt, that can possibly be considered a refusal to test by federal regulations on a federal test. That if we say, okay, you need to make an attempt, and somebody says, I will not make an attempt yet, that can be considered a refusal to test. So the donor cannot delay that test.
But while the test does not start until you are called back, your actions while at the facility can be considered in the testing process.
Exactly.
So moving on to step 3, the positively identifying the donor as the individual selected for testing. Generally speaking, a donor comes in, you have some type of an authorization form that lists your name. It may list an ID number, something like that. The collector is required to, compare the name on that paper to the person standing in front of them, along with a photo ID of that person.
Yeah. And that photo ID has to be one of two things. It either needs to be a government-issued ID, or it needs to be an employer-issued ID. Either are acceptable.
Right.
But it needs to be you cannot bring in your Costco card with your picture on it and say, this is my ID. No, it's not. You cannot bring in, your credit card that has your little picture on it. No. Your bus pass with your picture on it, it's not photo ID. It needs to be a government-issued ID. And, we will even, there's some school IDs we can accept. There's some school IDs we cannot accept. But it has to be, like I said, either a photo ID that's government issued, or or that it was employer issued. So yes, we can take employer, issued ID cards. And the other thing we can do is somebody does not have ID on them. If we have positive identification by an employer representative, we can accept that. But that employer representative cannot just be a fellow coworker. It needs to be more the designated employer representative. And I can, we can actually legally take that over the phone too. I can have that person, that DER, give me a description of that person over the phone legally. But in many cases, we actually will tell our especially in a random or a reasonable suspicion situation, we will tell our DERs, don't worry about having that person go get their ID. Grab them, get them to the collection site if you suspect something. Because we don't necessarily want them to go back to their car, back to their locker, to go get,
to have access to any adulterant,
to go get their ID, to basically bring their fake specimen with them.
Right.
And I have had many of employers tell me over the years that doing a locker search, they have discovered that some people always have a fake specimen with them at all times. So in the case of a random situation or a reasonable suspicion, I definitely want that person's, the supervisor to grab that person and bring them over, and then they can identify them for us. But we do require that some type of positive identification of that donor at the time we do that collection, whether it is a photo ID or by positive identification by the employer representative.
And I do want to touch on a little bit with photo IDs. The prevalence of digital photo IDs and the use of that can be used in these cases, as long as it is through those particular apps or accesses. Having a photo of your ID is not as
it's not going to be acceptable.
It's not going to be acceptable. But if you are using an app, like there are some DMV apps that have been accepted by state and federal agencies for use for identification, those situations can be used as well.
But we do also seen a huge rash of fake IDs being used out there. And that is whether somebody is bringing that fake ID just to try to pose as their buddy. But also, we've also caught a lot of people who are not in this country legally, and that there are services employment services out there that are getting them fake identification, and they are not good fake identification. And we've had to turn a lot of people away for testing because they have brought in an obvious fake ID with them.
And it is the collector's responsibility to make sure that the integrity of the ID that is being provided is accurate and has not been tampered with, and then making sure that it does actually look like the person that is standing in front of them. And there are ways that collectors can help to confirm. In the case of like a fake ID, they may ask the donor to provide their full name. They may ask them their date of birth or something on that to make sure that, yes, this person is the person that this ID is for, and maybe this ID is accurate. But it is quite shocking the number of times that the donor does not know their date of birth. They get their name wrong. These are things that adults know. Those are red flags. So again, it is the donor's or the collector's responsibility to make this confirmation. And if they don't believe that the ID that is being provided is real, it is their responsibility to turn that person away.
So at this time, then we're basically starting that, the chain of custody. And part of that is we need to give the review with the donor the collection instructions and procedures. Basically, what that means is that the federal government used to require that the instructions procedures be printed on the back of the federal chain of custody form. But when they made a revision several years ago, they actually removed those instructions off of the back of the form. But what we do, since we're still required, that requirement is still there to review, to give the donor the option to review those instructions and procedures, we basically have them posted next to all of our collection areas. Or if we're doing an on-site, we basically bring a printed copy of that with us. And basically, we have to give that person the option to review the instructions and procedures for a drug test collection. Now, does that donor, are they required to read them? No, they're not. We basically say, here's the instructions. Would you like to review them or would you like to move on? If they indicate they would like to move on, we say, great. And we go to step 5. If they say we would like to review them, we allow them the opportunity to read through them.
Right.
So then we really get into the actual chain of custody. And under the federal rules, and we can do this both with federal and non-federal tests, is whether we are using a paper chain of custody form or an electronic chain of custody form. Obviously, a paper chain of custody form is just that. It is a multi-page. It's basically 5. It's
3 to 5.
It's 5 pages. It's 5 pages on a federal collection. That is basically a carbon copy all the way through. That is the chain of custody. Now, the federal government has allowed, in more recent years, the electronic chain of custodies, where we can do the entire process on the computer, and it prints out the copies at the very end of the collections. Now, there's benefits and drawbacks to both paper chains and electronic chains. Paper chains are definitely more apt for collectors to make errors, where the electronic chain really walks the collector through the process and helps eliminate many of the common errors that we were finding in the collection process. Are they electronic chains foolproof? No, they are not. But also, we've also noticed that the rules for electronic chains are stricter than the paper chains when it comes to errors being made, correctable flaws, where now some of these things are now more likely to end up being a fatal flaw. And we'll talk about some of those in a little bit as we go through the process. But, really, electronic chains are great. We try to use them as much as possible because it does solve about 90% of the errors being made were eliminated using the electronic chain of custody process, but not all collection sites are equipped to do electronic chain of custodies. The systems for electronic chains of custodies have to be approved by the federal government, so there's only a handful of authorized electronic chain of custody systems out there that we can use. But like I said, there are a few things with the electronic chains that have where I can correct an issue on a paper chain. I can't always correct it on the electronic chain of custody system. So yes, there are incredible benefits to electronic chains, but there are definitely a few limitations on there that drive a TPA crazy.
Exactly. The beauty of an electronic chain of custody is it really eliminates the omission of information, because if something isn't filled out, it won't let you proceed. The difficulty, or the part that where errors can be made is if the incorrect information is provided, that's incorrect information. You can't forget to check a box, but you could obviously check the wrong box. So again, that is the pros and cons is right there. It's omission, but doesn't, eliminates omission, but it doesn't guarantee that the correct information has been provided.
Exactly. So one of the things with, our step 5 is the collector completes the administrative part of the chain of custody form. What that administrative part of the chain of custody form is the company's name, so basically the employer's name, an address that can either be the employer's or your CTPA's, and then it has a phone number and fax number of the employer. The phone number and fax number has to be the employer's phone and fax number. It cannot be your CTPA's phone and fax number. And that is something that I do find on a regular basis of, where CTPAs are not keeping their clients in compliance, is they are printing the CTPA's phone and fax number there and not the specific employers, or they're not putting the specific employer's company name in that administrative part of the chain of custody form. Also on the administrative part of the chain of custody form is going to be the medical review officer's information. We're going to have the reason for the test. Is this a pre-employment, a random, post-accident? What's the reason we are doing a test? And what mode is that person being sent in for? Are they federal motor carrier? Are they federal aviation, federal railway? On a federal chain, we have to identify what mode they are in. So that's one of the real benefits of the electronic chain of custody forms, is that the employer or the CTPA is populating that information. So when that donor walks in, we are scanning a barcode. It pulls up the right company, the right reason for the test, in the right mode, unless the person scheduling the test incorrectly entered it.
Right.
But then that error is back on the person ordering the test, not on the collection site when there is an issue there. So I said that first step, is completing that administrative part of the chain of custody.
I think it's important to note, even with an electronic chain of custody where we are pulling up that information utilizing a barcoded authorization form, it is still important for that donor and for that collector to verify that you are testing for XYZ company and you are here for a pre-employment test, that you are verifying some information to make sure that it does come up correctly and that you weren't handed an incorrect form or or there was something wrong with that. Yeah. It's easiest to fix those inaccuracies before we get deep into the test than after the test has been completed.
We have seen times where, a busy collection site, they may be stacking up the authorization forms and they grab the wrong person's authorization, which is, and the test got completed to the wrong
company.
Donor. The wrong company, the wrong donor. And we'll generally catch them when we're looking at signatures. But sometimes that's after the fact, and that's causing a test to be canceled. It is, so that's also why it's important for the collector to make sure that they have the correct donor in front of them by saying, okay, you are here for this company, and this is your name, and this is your identification number. Mostly, it's also on the administrative part of the chain of custody form, is the donor's ID number. And generally, for the most part nowadays, we're using a driver's license number or their state issued identification number or their employee ID number. Those are generally the things we try to avoid using full Social Security numbers, just because of how sensitive that number is. There's times that we've used, the last 4 digits or 5 digits of a Social Security number, we don't want to use a whole Social Security number just because of the sensitivity
Right.
of that number.
So as we move into step 6, the donor is asked to remove any unnecessary outer clothing, briefcase, purse, and any personal belongings. They'll be asked to empty their pockets, and generally they will be asked to place that into some type of a secured area, whether it be a locker or cabinet or somewhere where it is deemed to be safe.
So on step 6, which we're having them remove any unnecessary outer clothing, briefcases, personal belongings.
Okay.
There is a fine line between that donor's privacy and the integrity of that. So we want to make sure they do have the ability to lock up those items, but also we need to look at certain situations, like is somebody wearing religious headgear? If they are wearing religious headgear, I cannot ask somebody to remove their religious headgear. But though many people in Texas may want to think that a cowboy hat is religious headgear, it's not. But religious headgear, we cannot ask somebody to remove. If somebody is wearing a sweater, how are they wearing that sweater? Are they wearing it as a jacket, or are they wearing it as more of a shirt? If they are wearing it as a jacket, I have to ask them to remove any
of that outerwear
clothing. If they're wearing it as a shirt, where the only thing underneath there is either bare chest or undergarments, then it needs to stay on. I can't have somebody bring their purse in with them. So anything that does not need to be in that bathroom should stay out of that bathroom. But I also cannot ask somebody to change into like a hospital gown. That is against the rules.
Right.
So we do walk a fine line between that invasion of privacy and that integrity. So we do, like all our facilities, I have lockers for, for our donors, to be able to lock up items. But then, the next thing is we also ask them to, step 7 of this is we ask them to empty their pockets and display items in them. Now, things such as wallets, money clips, wad of cash, I actually want to have that donor keep on them. The reason behind that is we also, we can inspect that they have it. I can ask somebody to open up their wallet.
Right.
But because of the value of those items, we do not want that person to come back to us and said, they left them out of that, outside, out of their view, and then say, well, there's a $20 bill missing here.
Right.
I'm missing this. It's like, no, you're not. So I've had people, throw a huge wad of cash out in front of me, that was in their pocket. And I'm like, that goes back in your pocket.
Yeah.
I can have them empty their pockets. I can see have them, rabbit ear their pockets so I can see, that they are completely empty. But certain items such as wallets, we will tell them to keep on them.
Or they can utilize a locker and have that ability to lock it, and they have the only access to that key.
Exactly. So we do walk, like I said, that fine line. But so certain things we do ask them to, we do rather that they lock them up versus just leaving them out on the counter. Because I also, sometimes like, well, you did this while I was in the bathroom. No, we didn't. That's also why all of my facilities, we have security cameras outside of the restrooms. That way it gets rid of any false accusations that we tampered with their stuff.
As we move into that next step, that you've now, eliminated any extra items to be able to have access to during that collection process. So now the donor is instructed to wash their hands. Generally, they need to be using soap and water, and then they'll be asked to dry their hands. And this helps to eliminate basically anything that might be on the person's hands that could potentially adulterate the specimen. Any bleach products, cleaning products, dirt, soil, grease, any of that could have an effect on the drug test sample.
So as a collector, I'm required to watch that person wash and dry their hands to make sure they are actually doing it. And when when we want, that they are using soap, and we prefer that they use a foaming soap because there's less chance of adulteration that, where they're trying to get maybe a little piece of like a bar soap under their fingers,
right,
that they can, drop in the specimen to adulterate it. But we have to watch them wash and dry their hands, and we do want, the big thing is we do want, it sounds, we want to make sure they did not dip their hands beforehand in such as like bleach or other adulterants, because it sounds disgusting, but people will dip their hands and then they will pee right across their hands
right,
to get that bleach off to try to adulterate that specimen. Especially with things like bleach, we generally will know right away because we will get that strong odor of the bleach in there, but we are required to make sure. And if that donor refuses to wash and dry their hands, that can be considered a refusal to test under the federal regulations.
Again, when the donor was offered the opportunity to review the steps and procedures, number 8 very clearly states, collector instructs donor to wash and dry hands. It is part of the process, and each of these steps do need to be completed.
It's all hitting the integrity of that specimen.
So going on to number 9 is at the point where now that a collection container is selected by the donor and the collector, it's unsealed. So most specimen cups come with some type of a seal. They're either in a plastic bag or they have like a foil on top that gets peeled back, and then,
or some of them have it like a security seal, like a plastic security seal around it that we have to
break that seal.
To break that seal beforehand. So the collection container can either be selected by the donor or the collector, but it is the collector who has to unseal that specimen. And when I am, that collection cup. So when I'm opening that cup, one thing I make sure, and I always train my collectors to do is that we dump out the contents, because that's where the tamper-proof bag and the vials are
generally inside the cup.
In that cup. But I tell my collectors, do not ever put your fingers in there, because we don't want where we potentially have something on our fingers that could adulterate.
Right. The collector should only be, and really collector and the donor should only be touching the exterior of that actual specimen cup.
And when we're doing it, I want to make sure that when I'm unsealing that cup, that it is in full view of my donor. So they see that cup from the moment it is unsealed to, walking in that this cup is now in their visual contact at all times from the point it is unsealed. And I also want to inspect my cup before I send them in there to make sure there are no cracks in that cup.
Right.
Because it is terrible. It is awful when somebody walks back out after providing a specimen and there's a cracked cup and now we're trying to...
There's a stream coming across your floor.
Yes, and we're trying to salvage to make sure that we still have a sufficient specimen to send to the laboratory. So we always want to make sure we're inspecting those cups, because there are times that, yes, they can get a crack in them beforehand in the shipping process. So we want to make sure that we're inspecting them beforehand.
Exactly. So going on to step 10, we're getting into this process now. The donor is going to take that collection container into the area for providing a specimen. So whether they're going into the stall, into the restroom, whatever that secured area is, and they will be asked to provide a specimen. They will also be instructed that they have 4 minutes in and out of that restroom to provide that specimen. So
yeah, we always give, as a collector, we're always going to give somebody a few instructions. When I'm sending them into that restroom, I'm going to tell that person, please, I need a minimum of this amount of urine, which is, I need at least 45 milliliters. I would generally ask for 60. I tell them I always ask for more than I need, because I do have people who take me too literally. If I tell somebody I need 45 milliliters, they will pee right to that 45 milliliter line, not one drop more.
yeah.
But the problem was they were holding that cup at an angle. And so when I put that cup on a flat surface and look at it, they only have less than 45, and I need 45 for a federal collection. Minimum 45 for a collection. So I always ask for more than I need.
Right.
And I'd rather somebody walk out and say, I was not able to give you enough, and I look at it and like, well, no, it's...
We're good.
We're good here. Then, I'd rather ask for more and take what I need than to ask exactly what I need and the person come up short. Because sometimes just that one little extra push was maybe those couple extra drops was all I needed to get into that. They needed to get to that 45 line, but they need to provide it on one attempt, and they cannot be in that restroom for more than 4 minutes. Why no more than 4 minutes? Because I have to have this temperature within basically between 90 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. If somebody, urine will come out of the body at body temperature, but it will instantly cool down a little bit, slightly, maybe a degree or two at most when it hits the cup. But anything beyond 4 minutes, that specimen risk cooling down too much that I now are dealing with a potential out of temperature specimen. And if I have an out of temperature specimen, we'll talk about in a few, I'm actually now going to have to ask for a new collection under direct observation.
I wanted to just touch a little bit too on where you're mentioning the 45 milliliters. That is dictated by both federal or non-federal testing, that it is the amount of urine that the laboratory needs to do any testing. We provide or take that specimen and we put it into 2 vials typically. The first vial will have 30 milliliters in it. The second vial needs to have a minimum of 15 milliliters in it. The first vial is what the lab is going to use in this initial testing process. And they need enough to do an initial screening and any type of confirmation testing. So if there are substances that pre-screen as non-negative, they're going to take some additional specimen and run further testing for each drug that may have indicated that there was a non-negative. So they need enough for that. Then that second vial is saved for a later date. Should a donor request to have a specimen retested, we need to have enough of that original specimen on hand to be able to do any type of retesting.
So federal requirements does require that split collection. Non-federal best practice is to do a split collection, though you could take a single collection, which is only 30 milliliters. But so those 2 vials, the first one is that 30 milliliters. All that testing is being done, including if there's any calibration checks that the lab has to rerun a specimen because they are because they actually, at every run they do, they are actually looking, they actually have a control specimen in there that if they get a reading that's just not right on that control, they will rerun that, have to go back to the specimen, take some more out of it, and rerun that specimen, that entire batch again. So they have to have enough. So 30 milliliters is enough for them to do all that testing plus any confirmation testing required. Whereas that 15 is basically put into frozen storage generally on non-negatives. On a negative test, if something tests negative, the original specimen probably will be disposed by the laboratory within a couple days. If it is a non-negative test, generally meaning it tested positive, or there was some other reading on it that was, suspected adulterants.
Out of norm.
It will then be put into frozen storage for any challenges. And that is, so if somebody basically wants to challenge a test, they can request from the medical review officer that their split bottle B be sent to a different certified laboratory for reconfirmation testing. I will honestly tell you, in my 35 years of doing this, anybody who's ever asked for that split bottle B to be run is always come back at the same result as the original test.
Right.
Now, is it possible that there, is? Yeah,
but it would be very rare.
It's a very rare thing. But yes, that is the purpose of both the A and the B bottle. Now, also the other part of the benefit, and also why I also want to talk about where, we need 45 milliliters. I asked for 60. Is I rather have both my A and B bottle both have 30 in it. That way, if anything happens to that A bottle, such as, say maybe in transit, maybe, there's times that they have the A bottle broke in transit. If I have at least 30 in my B bottle, the laboratory can run that B bottle as that primary specimen.
Right.
So it is something that, yes, we do try to collect both an A bottle and a B bottle, and that is, for federal testing, that is required that we have at least, that A in that B bottle, and that we have at least 30 milliliters in the A bottle, at least 15 in that B bottle. So they walk out, they hand that specimen to the collector, which is step 11. At that point, we're really going to go straight into step 12, which is the collector needs to check the specimen temperature. It has to be between 90 and 100 degrees to be considered within temperature. When it is not, it's, when it's not, that's all start going to, raise some red flags, which is, I said, why it's important that somebody's in there for, is only in that restroom for no more than 4 minutes, because then that specimen cannot cool down enough to be below 90 degrees. Now, I've had many indications that somebody's handed me a specimen that is either too hot or too cold. Normally too cold, but there's times that somebody's handed me specimens that are too hot. Every one of our specimen cups has a temperature strip on them that we can read. But I can also tell you that every collector can tell you if a specimen is within temperature or not just by the feel of that cup. It's like taking the temperature of your child. You put your hand on your head, on their forehead. If somebody is running a fever. If it's too hot, or by touch if it's too cold. In addition, all my collection sites also have laser thermometers equipped there that we can where we're not actually putting something into that specimen, but we can zap it with a laser thermometer and tell you the exact temperature of that specimen if we have any doubts that that specimen is within temperature or not. I've had somebody hand me a temperature. I remember one time on site, somebody handing me a specimen that was 120 degrees. And they just like, I haven't been feeling well. I'm just running I'm running a fever. I'm like, this is 120 degrees. You would be dead.
Right.
If you produced a specimen that was 120 degrees.
Right.
Again, why you never want to use the, you never want to use the microwave anywhere near a
drug testing facility. I think in all of this too, I want to point out that in this, once that donor hands that specimen to the collector, the donor needs to stay right there and be observing all these next procedures.
Yes.
It's, to ensure that nothing is being done outside of their site.
It's so common that we have donors say, well, let me go wash my hands. No, you can't do it yet. You need to stay here and you need to watch me
get your
specimen
sealed
and get it sealed up before you can go and wash your hands. You need to stay within the site. If I have to physically follow that person because they're trying to walk away with that specimen in hand so it's staying in their visual contact, trust me, we will.
Right.
We will do that. But yes, I have many people who hand us a specimen that is out of temperature, and then it's they give us every excuse in the world, or we're just wrong and we don't know how to,
Right. But in reality, that collector is essentially using 3 ways to determine the temperature by just that general feel of the cup. Because again, they've done this a lot. If they've been doing this for a long time, you do get a sense of what that should feel like. You have the strip on the cup. While not always accurate, it does give us a good indication of where the temperature is at.
It's usually within 1 to 2 degrees.
Exactly. And then that final, when necessary, we will use another type of thermometer, typically a laser one, so we're not ever touching that specimen. Because again, we don't want, just like we're concerned that a donor could potentially get adulterants in there, the collector does not want to be ever touching that specimen for those reasons of making sure that there is no potential adulterant being added to that specimen.
So the next step is that the collectors also examining that specimen for unusual color, odor, and other signs of adulteration. So what I talked about earlier, that we color our water blue. So if somebody's handing me a specimen that is blue or green in color, because as the old was it Glad that the baggie was yellow and blue make green.
Yes.
Is the color right? Now, for some, is it always going to be yellow? No. It may be orange in color. It may be more brown, depending on how dehydrated somebody is. It could be semi-clear.
Right.
It could be red or purple in color, depending on time of the month. For a female donor. But there's certain colors it should not be. And blue and green are, now, when I say that, are there times that there is a medication out there that does turn your urine blue. I will tell you that. But as a collector, I cannot just take your word that you're on that medication.
Right.
It's actually, if we see something, we're basically going to have to go into a direct observed procedure. And then while we're directly observing it, and if it comes out blue or green again, then at least it was directly observed, and we
know it came from your body that way,
Exactly.
and not because there was a situation where a person may have tried to adulterate.
So we are looking for, like I said, color. We are also looking for odor. And I've had a lot of people argue with me that you cannot smell my urine. Well, we don't try to actually go up and take a deep sniff of your urine, but certain smells do
Permeate
out. One, bleach, definitely. Strong chemical odors it should not have. One that we do find quite a bit is the smell that a lot of the fake specimens on the market, when people are bringing a substituted specimen in, we are getting specimens that smell like burnt plastic. When we're getting a smell, and that's permeating out of there, that if we are getting that smell,
right,
we are going to go into a direct observed test. And that is where I get so many people arguing with it. You cannot smell my urine. It's illegal to smell. It's like, actually, no, it's actually in the requirements that odor is something that we have to look at and consider.
Right.
And there are unusual odors. Like I said, we are not trying to take a deep whiff of your urine. But
no one wants to smell your urine on purpose.
It sounds funny, but yes. But yes, that is something we do find on a regular basis. And I even get employers trying to, when their employee goes back and says, well, this person, you can't do it. I'm like, and trust me, I got Google reviews on my company that, because people marking us down because they got caught cheating. And they're trying to plead their case on Google reviews. It's sad. But yes, we are looking at things such as color, odor. I can also, there are also some other signs of using synthetic urine that we sometimes can look for, because I can actually, there's certain things real urine does that synthetics have a different
response
to that, we can sometimes look at, are we seeing a little bit of foam? Real urine generally foams a little bit, where synthetics generally will not. I can also, a lot of times, once I get it actually put into a vial, I can actually, tilt it over and kind of do a quick little shake of it. And what real urine should act like and what synthetic acts like have two different responses to it.
Right. You're kind of looking at that viscosity of the urine. In that, we're also looking at, the clarity of it. Is it kind of muddy or, have a characteristic that wouldn't be typical of a urine specimen.
So if we have any reason to suspect the validity that this really is real urine, whether by temperature or basically real urine or that donor's urine.
Right.
Because it is possible that somebody brought in a real urine specimen, but
it wasn't theirs.
It was not theirs. They stopped off on their way home and, on the way to the collection facility, and they stopped at home and had their child
had a friend or family member provide them a spare specimen.
Yeah. Or I've had times that we've gotten specimens come back from the lab telling us that it was not human urine, that they got their dog to provide a specimen for them. But when we have a reason to question whether this is that specimen came from them, we are going to give that donor an opportunity to provide a second specimen. But that second specimen is going to be under direct observation. And what does that mean? It means we are going to, the collector is going to physically walk into that stall, into that restroom with you. Now, one requirement for a direct observed test is that is that that donor has to be the same gender as the donor. So if the collector is somebody of the opposite gender, we will then have another collector or somebody else, maybe even the supervisor of the company, if that's who's available, of the same gender, go in there and we'll give them instructions to do a direct observed test. Now, the federal requirements for a direct observed test is that that person has to raise their shirt, dress, blouse, whatever it is, above the navel. They have to drop their pants in their underwear to about knee level. So they are basically completely exposed from about navel down to your knees, and they are required to do a full turnaround in front of the collector to ensure that there are no strap-on devices, nothing being brought in with them. Now that donor is allowed to put their clothing back to their normal position, but still that collector now still has to physically watch that urine go from body part into cup. And they have to watch that entire process. Not the most comfortable situation for either the donor or the collector. One thing I tell my collectors is, sometimes you may be joking around beforehand a collection, making loose conversation with a donor. As soon as you get into a direct observed test, this is the time you need to be the most professional, you need to be the most serious, because we are walking a very, very fine line between invasion of privacy and sexual harassment and employers' right to know. So this is a very fine line, so we do watch. But we kind of joke beforehand that, it's kind of, in the collection world, that this process that the DOT requires us to push through the raise your shirt, drop your pants, spin around, is like doing the Hokey Pokey.
Right.
But never, ever tell a donor, I need you to do the Hokey Pokey.
Right.
Okay? I've heard it happen before. That is very extremely unprofessional. You do not want that to happen. You need to be of the utmost respect and professionalism when you are doing a direct observed testing. We are all business when it comes to that point. We are doing a direct observed test. Now,
yes. I do want to point out in this process, so when that donor brings that specimen out, the collector is doing their observations, determining the validity of that specimen. They are then actually pouring that specimen into the vials as required. They are sealing those vials shut. They are putting a security tape over the top of them that typically is barcoded with the same barcode as what is on that chain of custody. And they are asking the donor to initial and date that specimen bottle, each of the bottles. Once that specimen has been secured in the bottle with the security tape, that is when the collector will then present those next steps. So this specimen does not, is good and we're going to proceed, or this specimen does not meet these these check boxes and we need to collect a second test.
The direct observation, we're not going to get into a direct observation until we actually complete all 25 steps.
Right.
We're going to get everything done, all 25 steps on the original specimen. At that point is where we will then go into the second direct observation. So pointing out that, yes, we have direct observation requirements, but and what things are going to trigger that direct observation, but we are not going to proceed with that direct observation until we actually go through all 25 steps, get that first specimen completely sealed up, right, all the paperwork distributed, then we will be going into that direct observation. So, so step 13 was that we were examining that specimen for unusual color, odor, other signs of adulteration. Step 14 is that we are checking the volume of that specimen, making sure we have at least 45 milliliters. If we do not have 45 milliliters, we will go into bladder requirements, which we will talk about shortly. At that point, the collector goes to step 15, which is they transfer the specimen bottles into both the A and the B bottles. They are pouring those vials off in front of that donor. They are, at that point, affixing a bottle seal to both that A bottle and that B bottle. The collector is going to be the one to date the seals. The donor is going to initial the seals. And those seals have to be initialed while they are on the vial. They cannot be done while they are on the chain of custody form. And we catch that quite a bit. That is, that we have some telltale signs.
Telltale signs, yes.
That the collector violated that requirement by allowing a donor to initial the seals while they were not on the vials. Now, the purpose of that is I want to make sure those seals are on. One thing I will do as a collector too, I take an extra step, is I will then also make sure I'm rubbing my edges of my seal down, because when we get to a later step where we're putting it in, I want to make sure that I don't have anything that is going to catch.
Right.
When we're sealing it, when we're putting it into a Tupperware in a bag, to make sure that somehow that seal got torn in the process. But while they are initialing it, it needs to be on that bottle, because that's that person saying, "This is my specimen."
Right.
Now, if that seal is not, if they're initialing that seal before it gets put onto that vial, hey, technically, I can go put that seal on anybody's specimen I want. Would I ever do that? No. But
the procedure is that it needs to be on the vial, because we don't want that opportunity for it to be placed.
Yeah.
And by initialing it, that donor is saying, "This is my specimen. I've seen it go into this vial," and they need to be making sure that they are also following that. Is it difficult to write on when it's on the vial? Yes, it is. However, for the integrity of the process, that is what needs to happen.
And that is a key to the integrity, that this person is saying, "This is my specimen. I am initialing it, saying this was sealed in front of me.
I watched and confirmed that this is."
So we do look for, on a paper chain of custody, if somebody initialed those seals while they were still on while they were still on the chain of custody, I will see ghost images of that person's initials on all the carbon copies.
Right.
And so will the DOT auditor when he audits that company. When you are getting your employer copy back from your collection site and you see ghost images of where the seals were on that chain of custody, originally were on that chain of custody, and you can see
there was writing there.
There's writing there. There's initials there. That's saying, hey, you need to go look at and have a word with your collection site.
Right.
But the other part too is we have to make sure that those seals are not torn at all. When I'm putting those seals on, I need to be very careful as the collector not to tear my seals, because if I have a torn seal, that could show that was a tampered to the laboratory. That may be demonstrating that specimen was potentially tampered with.
Right.
And which would be a break in the chain of custody of this process. So I have to be very careful when I am removing those seals from the chain of custody and putting them on my bottles, that I am not tearing that seal at all. And I've had times just because maybe somebody handed me a chain of custody that was in a vehicle, for a little too long, and there's maybe a little too much glue that was on that seal, that being the most careful as I could not get that seal off that chain of custody without tearing it. I remember one night being on site at a facility, and I was being so careful, but these, the chain of custodies I had must have been a little bit too old and a little too much glue on them. I literally went through 5 chain of custody forms in order to get 2 seals, both the A seal and the B seal off, without tearing a single seal. But I have to make sure that the chain of custody number on my seal matches the chain on my paperwork, on my chain of custody form, and that if all of a sudden I tear a seal, I need to start a brand new chain of custody form.
And I think we've ran into too where it's either, because of heat or, exposure, can make it extra sticky, but it can also have the opposite effect. It is a sticker and it can dry out, and then it is also not sticking properly to that bottle.
And I've had collectors say, "Oh, I'm just going to put some tamper evident tape over the top of it."
Can't do that.
To make it. You can't do that. That is a breach of that basically demonstrates that this is a potentially tampered with specimen, and the laboratory will reject it as a fatal flaw. So we do have to be very careful when we are, when we're removing the seals from their backing, getting them onto the bottles. And then, like I said, I like to rub the edges of mine down just to make sure that they don't have an opportunity to tear in the packaging and transportation process. So once we affix those bottle seals, that's where the donor, has the opportunity, if they want to go wash their hands again. At that point, the collector is going to conduct a post-collection inspection of that collection area, meaning we're going to walk back into that bathroom, make sure we don't see anything that we should not see in there. Is there something, as we told the donor, they're not allowed to flush the toilet. Is there anything floating in that toilet that we see in that toilet that should not be there? I'm looking behind the toilet to see, did they try to hide a bag of something? Am I seeing any signs, but also why that person was in that restroom? When I actually kind of taking a step back, is one thing we also do look for is sound. That when when we send that person into that restroom, that collector is still going to be standing by that door. And do we hear a popping of a cap?
Or extra ruffling around of like, you can tell that it's not just them taking their pants down. It is some type of extra that doesn't seem quite normal.
Are we hearing baggies? Are we hearing caps? Are we hearing plastic sounds? Are we hearing popping sounds? Things that should not be happening.
Right.
So we could conduct that post-collection inspection of the collection area. At that time, if there's any excess urine, anything more than that 60, potentially 60 milliliters, we are taking that with us and we are disposing of any excess specimen at that time. At that point, the donor reads and completes the donor certification and contact information on the chain of custody form. That is their information of how to contact them. That's their name, because the only place on a federal chain of custody form that their name is not on the laboratory copy. It's on the subsequent copies of chain of custody that go to the employer, the donor copy, the medical review officer copy, the collector copy that has the donor's name on it. but we also have their contact information, phone number, daytime phone numbers, evening phone numbers, and the DOT has more recently put an option in there for somebody's email address to be put in there. But we have to have that information. The purpose of that contact information is, should there be anything that is detected at the laboratory, that the ability for our medical review officer to have the ability to contact that donor to find out, hey, do you have a legal prescription? Is there a legal reason that
this substance
was found in your specimen, was detected? So we do, so that's why, the donor at that point is also stating, and they are signing, that this is my specimen and I have not adulterated in any way. I have not substituted in any way. They are saying this specimen, everything was done correctly. This is my specimen.
And I certify basically the validity of it. Essentially, that donor is they are printing their name, they are signing their name, they are putting today's date or the date of that test, and they are also including their date of birth. That's another marker that the MRO and others are using to kind of match that specimen with that donor.
So a lot of that is like when the medical review officer is trying to contact the donor, and we want to make sure medical review officer wants to make sure he has the correct donor on the line.
Right.
That person he's talking to is the actual donor and not somebody else. Then it is, okay, what is your date of birth? What was the ID number that you used on your chain of custody?
Right.
That's going to help them say, yes, I am talking to the right person.
Because in the case of the medical review officer speaking with the donor, it is generally done over the phone. Yes. So they need to have those methods in place to be able to verify that they are talking to the actual donor. And, we run into many cases where there is a John Smith Sr., a John Smith Jr., a John Smith III. Again, they could all be living under the same roof. We need to make sure, that that medical review officer is speaking to the correct donor.
It also even helps the employer, especially where I have companies that junior, senior, and the third are all working for the same company.
Or just two John Smiths.
Yeah. That it helps at one extra way to identify, besides just donor ID, that it is that we have the right person identified.
Right.
Here.
And we have definitely ran into that with companies when we've had to verify that we were looking at tests for the correct donor. Because, and that, again, that date of birth is one area where it allows everyone to make sure that the correct person is being identified.
So then the next thing is, once the donor signs it, now the collector has to assign certification that they are, what time was this done? What's the date? And that they properly completed the that the collection was done successfully in accordance with the rules. Now, I will tell you, this is where we start getting into some situations with electronic chain of custody. And one of the limitations, and probably one of the most common problems we are dealing with the electronic chain of custody, is when we get into the signature requirements. That there are times that we're generally using, most of the time with the electronic chains, we are using electronic signature pad. Sometimes they fail, and they don't want to print out the chain. They don't want to print out this allow for them to electronically sign. In those cases, we have to then print out the paperwork and have the person physically sign with a wet ink signature. But besides that, once we print out, do the electronic signature, if we take that electronic signature, the collector at this point is now printing the various chains of custodies. The very first one that they print out is the laboratory chain of custody form, which I said can be different than the.
It will look different than the other pages.
Because on federal test, the donor's name is not, and contact information is not on the laboratory copy. So it is imperative that the laboratory copy is the one that is going to be sealed with the specimen. It goes to the laboratory. Now, if the collection site had any printing errors, that if they cannot get the printer to print the first time, and they have to go back and now ask the system to reprint a chain of custody because the printer jammed or it maybe didn't have paper in it, and now they had to go back and put paper, or that the connection to the printer failed, it did not print out for any reason on the first attempt. On electronic chain of custody, when you ask for it to reprint the chain of custody, it will physically say that this is a reprint on that chain of custody. If the laboratory copy indicates that it is a reprint, by federal law, the collector has to, in addition to having their electronic signature on it, they have to take pen and wet ink sign next to their original signature, plus they have to fill out an additional affidavit form stating why they reprinted that chain of custody. If the collector fails to wet ink, to put their wet ink signature on it and complete that affidavit and send to the laboratory that way, it is going to produce an additional affidavit that has to get completed with a wet ink signature. And when we say it has to get completed again by wet ink signature, meaning it's going to hold up that specimen for several days.
Right.
Because the collector has to go back, reprint that chain, wet ink sign it, and they can't fax it, they can't scan it and email it. They have to now send it by some type of courier service like a FedEx or a UPS back to the laboratory, and the laboratory has to receive that wet ink signature. And when that happens, it holds up and delays a specimen for days at a time.
And it especially can hold it up if the collector doesn't respond to that request for the wet ink signature. But also just it takes at least a day to overnight that form back to the lab, and then the lab needs to process this. It all takes time, and it can definitely delay a situation.
And the other situation I see too often from at CTPA and MRO department sides is that the collector, instead of putting the laboratory copy, sealed the laboratory copy with the specimen, they put one of the other copies in there that actually had the donor's name on it. And the laboratory cannot, by law, accept that. They have to get that laboratory copy resent to them with a wet ink signature on it. And again, that delays specimens by days. And then in many cases, because we have unresponsive collection sites, that do not want to return that wet ink signature, get it processed, and do it properly, we've had many tests canceled due to that wet ink signature not coming in. So I'm going to probably circle back to that one in a minute. So as I said, the donor completes that chain of custody form. The collector places that specimen bottles and the lab copy of that chain of custody form into that leak-proof bag. At that point, it is sealed in front of the donor. At that point, the collector gives the donor their copy, the donor copy of the chain of custody form. In that point, the collector dismisses the donor.
So we're at step 23 now. We've dismissed the donor, and we go into a couple of the final steps as the collector places the sealed bag into shipping container. In most cases, with most labs, it is going to be sent via overnight courier, a FedEx, a UPS, to that laboratory.
Or unless it's close enough to the laboratory
Right.
that they can actually be running couriers there. Or, some collection sites, because of volumes they do, will have a courier pick them up. And then they take them actually to a commercial airline, to ship that way. But they basically are sealed, packaged in a shipping container. Courier gets them delivered to the laboratory. And at that point, step 25, the collector distributes any remaining copies of the chain of custody form. What that means is the collector, same business day, has to transmit to the medical review officer their copy of the chain of custody form. The employer copy is required to be sent to the designated employer representative of the company. Now, one of the huge benefits of the electronic chain of custody forms is that it automatically generally will do that.
Right.
And I say generally will do that because in the electronic chain of custody forms, and this is an area that I definitely see sometimes that the collectors think, oh, wait, I got to the point where I signed my name, but a lot of the electronic chain of custody forms have a little button at the bottom that says collection done. Complete. And when they fail to check that little button, when they click that little button that says collection complete, the electronic chains do not get distributed.
They're not populated those.
In the electronic, uploaded into the system to the medical review officer and to the employer.
And the reason is because the system still believes that collection is still in process.
So
it has not been marked that you are complete.
Yeah. So technically at this point, we've hit the 25 steps here. Okay? But as I said, there are things that we have to look at. From the MRO's office, if they do not get that, where that electronic upload on the electronic chain of custody came to them, now we're having to go call to that collection site and ask them to fax us or email us their copy of that chain of custody form. Now, the problem is that by law, a collection site is required to keep a collector copy for so many days, depending if it is a Department of Health and Human Services, basically a federal employee collection, or if it is a DOT collection. They actually have different retention periods for the collector. I have found collection sites not printing out their copy of the chain of custody form. They are relying completely on the electronic system. And if they fail to click the little box, that the little checkbox, that little button at the end saying collection complete, and they didn't print out their chain of custody, now no one has a copy of that chain of custody form unless the donor who got their printed copy retained theirs. And I have so many donors who just automatically toss their copies.
Right.
And so if there's no printed copies that have the donor's name on it, we cannot have, then that test is going to get canceled by the medical review officer because they could not identify whose test it was. So it is important that they do that, that on electronic chain of custody, that they print out their copies and they retain a copy of their chain of custody form for a period of time. Again, circling back on that, those limitations about electronic chain of custody forms and wet ink signatures. We have canceled way too many tests because the collector failed to wet ink sign, or when they send it to the laboratories have not always been great at either getting the affidavits out timely,
right,
or getting that when that wet ink signature gets sent back to the laboratory, that they are getting them processed in a timely basis. What is the cost of this? This is where we actually get into a huge cost to our employers and a lot of frustration by the TPAs, the employers, the medical review office departments, that when a specimen gets delayed at the laboratory due to a lack of that wet ink signature or any type of affidavit, that this is very costly, because say I'm trying to hire an employee. If I cannot get that result, if I cannot result that out until this is resolved, how much is that company losing monetarily by having a job vacancy open?
right,
I've had trucking companies tell me it's costing them at least a couple $1,000s a day or more to sit a truck. So they're losing opportunity because they don't have somebody in that position. It is or we've had to cancel tests, or somebody's, say in a post-accident situation, if the company policy, is that they cannot return to work until they have a negative test, that person's off work that much longer and not getting getting a paycheck,
right,
because the collector did not do something proper that caused an affidavit, or basically that, or that wet ink signature, delay. It's a no-win situation. And like I said, I look at statistics on a regular basis when we're doing reports, and we see way too many tests that have been canceled because an affidavit was not returned, and it has to be done within a certain time frame. So there's things that we do look at this point. Now that this collection process, we've hit our 25 steps, there's times, like I said, we talk about there's potential refusals. Now, your service provider, which means your collector, your CTPA, and even in some cases your MRO, cannot determine a refusal. We've talked about on previous episodes that it is the DER's responsibility to determine that refusal. So as a collector, I can say, we feel that this was a refusal to test. Here's the reasons why. But it is the DER who makes that ultimate determination if something in that collection process that was deemed a refusal by the collector actually is going to be considered a refusal.
And some of those reasons that the collector might determine that it would be a refusal is that A, the donor did not provide a specimen. They left the facility before the completion of the test. They were not able to provide an adequate volume of specimen, or that they provided a specimen that did not meet those temperature, color, odor type situations, and the donor then refused to provide an additional specimen under direct observation. Any of those situations, that is when the collector is going to state that it was a refusal to test because they were unable to complete the testing process with an adequate specimen. But again, it then goes to that DER to really ultimately make that decision.
It is. And, the thing is that the DER needs to take into consideration not just their employees, their applicants' version. They need to take into consideration what the collection site is reporting to them. And I will tell you, we definitely deal with, many obstacles, that especially when somebody is trying to cheat, that donors they're trying to get the collectors to make an error. They're trying to distract the collector. We see sometimes when they're talking too much, or sometimes they're trying to, the collector is, the donor is trying to tell the collector how to do their job. The one that we hear all the time. Well, I've gotten tested so many times at this other collection site, and they always do it this other way. Well, because somebody else is doing it wrong, does not make it right.
Right.
We train our collectors to do it right, and I don't care what another collection site is doing
or not doing, as the case may be.
We do it the way the DOT mandates us to do it. We complete all 25 steps,
right.
And I don't care if somebody else is skipping them. We don't skip them. But we are dealing with hostile donors on a regular basis, especially when they get caught, potentially cheating.
Right.
Whether they are yelling at us, they are threatening us. We've had donors physically threaten our staff. They have physically threatened our medical review officers.
Right.
We've had cases that, literally, that our MRO literally has had to file injunctions and restraining orders against donors, and actually have had to file FBI reports because because they're in somebody in a different state who is, threatening harm to our collectors, our medical review officers for doing their jobs.
Right.
But one thing we have to watch is, employers trying to believe their donors over the collectors. I honestly will tell you that we as a collection site have no reason to falsely accuse and make up stories about your
applicants or employees.
We don't. There is nothing in it for us, to try to, there's no benefit for us to make somebody do a direct observed test or make them stay longer, not accept a urine specimen from them, because trust me, it is, we rather have an uneventful collection every time, because then we are dealing with happier people. We are not getting people threatening us. We are not getting people yelling at us or cussing at us. And we rather get them back out there and doing the things that, in moving on to our next donor. So when a collection site is reporting something, you need to probably take yes, there are 3 sides to every story. there is your donor side, there's our collector side, and the truth may lie somewhere in there. I will generally tell you that 90 some odd percent of the time, the truth is going to lie much closer to the collector side than to the donor side. And I said, I've been doing this for 35 years, and there's times I think I have seen everything out there. There are times that people still surprise me, even to this day, of what somebody comes up with or what situation has been. I will try not to go into some of those because some of them get a little. But I mean, we had a case last year of a donor trying to bribe one of my collectors. He offered him about $1,000 to help him cheat on a test. And fortunately, my collector basically said, yeah, no, because of his, and he reported it to me. I reported it to the employer, and the employer came back to me and said, I don't believe that. There's no way my employee did that. I go, well, I actually have it on camera with audio of the bribe. And
still didn't want to believe you.
He did not want to believe me. So he put the person back to work, but fortunately, I think I gave him enough doubt that he said maybe we put him into a non-safety sensitive role, and he said we're going to retest. You're going to call me in another week or two, and we're going to retest the person. But, is there any way we can? I'm like, well, yeah, we can, because we're going to do a non-regulated, I can go, we can surprise the person and do an oral fluid. So the person came back prepared to do a urine. We did an oral fluid test. That donor then proceeded to test positive for cocaine. And at that point, the DER, who just would not believe me, came back to me and said, I am sorry for doubting you.
I should have trusted.
He goes, I should have trusted you. He goes, going forward, he goes, I'm gonna, he goes, I know if it's coming from you, you guys are not going to make it up.
Right.
It happened, but yes, I had it on camera. It's, when you think you see everything, there's, like I said, we've had things. So as we kind of talked about, there are things that can happen. And there are things we kind of call, correctable flaws versus fatal flaws.
Those correctable flaws are things that an affidavit, which is basically a statement that is provided by the collector, is stating, confirming information that may have been missed or lacked on the chain of custody.
Most correctable flaws are basically an omission of information. Something that should not be serious enough to require the test to be canceled. Did the collector fail to check the mode the person was in? Did they fail to check that, the reason for the test, whether it was a pre-employment or a random? Did they not put the date in the right box?
Right.
There are things that we can fix with an affidavit, but affidavits do take
time.
Time. I will tell you, the affidavit process at most of the laboratories is once we ship that specimen to the laboratory, there's an assessor at the laboratory who's reviewing the chain of custody. If they see any omissions of information, they are taking that specimen and the chain of custody out of the testing queue. They are sending it to putting on a little cart, and sometime during the day they are going to send it to a different department that processes their affidavits. So that somebody in that department is now going to have to process this affidavit, send it by fax to the collection site, and hope that that collector is there that day.
Right.
And if that collector, best case scenario, they're there, they fill in their affidavit with the right information in it. They sign the affidavit attesting that they have the correct information with providing the correct information. They fax it back to the laboratory department that processes the affidavit. Now that department now has to process that affidavit, put it back in the system, and now that specimen now has to get sent back to the original testing department to get processed. Best case scenario, you're going to lose at least a full day of this process taking place. Again, what's the implications of losing a full day? Well, now that employee is not getting, if they're waiting on that drug test to go to work, they're not getting paid. If I have, equipment being sat because that person can't do their job, now that department or that truck, that vehicle, whatever it is maybe shut down. What is the lost revenue there? So there is a cost for that affidavit. And I said, best case scenario, we're losing a day on an affidavit. If it is a case, especially on the electronic chain of custodies, that we need a wet ink signature, we probably have lost 2 or 3 days minimum.
Right.
And times that, we discover that sometimes the time to get all this done has taken weeks. And, I may have lost that applicant because of this, or we've lost, we've lost that test. That test may get canceled because of those delays, or
right.
What were the implications of it? But now we also have things that are fatal flaws. Fatal flaws is a complete break in that chain of custody that is going to require that test to be canceled. That could be the seal was broken. There was an inadequate volume of specimen that was received at a laboratory, or maybe it broke in transit.
It could be that that the bottles were labeled incorrectly,
Yes.
whether the ID numbers on the bottle didn't match the chain of custody, or that the A label was attached to the B bottle and the B label was attached to the A bottle. That matters on a DOT test because, where we talked earlier, that they're using that first 30 milliliters, that A bottle, for the initial testing.
Actually, if you do reverse your labels, that's not actually a big deal. The laboratories actually do have the ability to redesignate a specimen. But there are other things, like I said, if there was a lack of, if the initials were not on the seals, and there's no documentation that the donor refused to initial, or if there's no signature, no donor signature on the chain of custody, and there is no documentation that the donor refused to sign, those are things that would be fatal flaws. If we cannot if a correctable flaw is not corrected within a certain time frame, that also will become a fatal flaw. So there are definitely implications to a fatal flaw, because now the collector now has to actually go through error correction training to
remedy so that those things don't happen again.
But there's also implications to that fatal flaw too, of in cases of a post-accident, a random test or a reasonable suspicion test, the tests are canceled. They cannot be recollected. So if I have a fatal flaw and it was on a random test, I cannot send that person back in for another random test. If it was a reasonable suspicion situation and that test just got canceled, I can't just say, okay, go test again unless I have reasonable suspicion again. And on a post-accident, post-accident situation, especially if it was a serious accident, it was like a fatality, serious injury, and the employer cannot produce that post-accident drug test because it was canceled.
There's huge implications.
There's huge implications in that, and it's not fun dealing with the attorneys when that happens. So you can't, because you have a fatal flaw, you can't say, I'm going to send that person back in. Now, on pre-employment, can you send somebody back in? Yeah, if they're willing to go. You may have lost that applicant because now they just got a job someplace else.
Right.
So you've lost that, you've lost that potential, valuable employee that you needed. So it is a no-win situation, which is why it's imperative that this collection process be done, properly. Which kind of gets us into, what does some of these terms mean when we start talking about, some of these tests. Now, actually, I do need to probably reverse myself, take a step back and talk about something I said I would talk about, which is shy bladders. Now, we talked about some of the problem collections we have. One of them is the shy bladder. So there are times that we ask somebody to provide a specimen, and we say we need 45 milliliters. If they cannot provide 45 milliliters on that first attempt, there is a very specific procedure that we are dictated to use. One, that donor is going to be given a 3-hour window from the
time of that first attempt.
First attempt to provide a specimen. We are going to provide the donor the opportunity to have some liquids, generally water, and we will generally give them, under DOT guidance, 40 ounces of liquid to consume over a time period, but that donor is allowed to have as many attempts as they want over that 3-hour time period, but they need to provide that 45 milliliters in basically one shot. We cannot take urine from multiple attempts and combine them into a single specimen in order to get our 45 milliliters. I need a single void to provide that 45 milliliters. Now, I was dealing with, looking at a situation the other day where obviously a collector violated that, because when the laboratory received the A bottle and the B bottle, they were two different colors, which basically said if we had one specimen that was poured off into the A and the B, the color is going to be consistent across both specimens. When they're different, it basically said
that's a red flag to the laboratory.
And that basically was a fatal flaw. That test got canceled. Because it was not a single void. But somebody's allowed up to 3 hours to provide a specimen. If they cannot provide a specimen within three hours, at that point, the collector is going to report a potential refusal to test. The medical review officer is going to get involved, and basically it's going to be recommended that the donor, if they are alleging that they have some type of medical condition that prohibit them from providing a 45 milliliter, they are now going to have to go see some type of specialist to provide documentation that they have a legitimate medical explanation of not being able to provide a specimen within a 3-hour time period. If they cannot provide that documentation from a acceptable physician, the medical review officer will, at that point, not the DER. The medical review officer is at that point the one who's going to determine a refusal to test.
Right. And I think the important thing here to remember from an employer standpoint and from a donor standpoint, when you are sending someone to take a test or you are going to take a test, you need to allow up to 3 hours for that test. Don't come in knowing you need to be somewhere in 20 minutes and, and then you run into a situation where you can't provide an adequate specimen. Because once we have started that process and called you back for that test, if you leave the facility without providing a specimen, it can be determined as a refusal to test. And we run into this all the time where a person can't provide an adequate specimen and, but I have another appointment I need to get to, or I need to pick up my kids from school, or I have to get back to work. The process and, again, the federal guidelines state you have up to 3 hours to provide that specimen. And if you leave before providing an adequate specimen, it is deemed a refusal to test. Again, ultimately, that DER gets to make that decision, but it is deemed a refusal to test if you leave the facility without providing that adequate specimen.
So yeah, we definitely are dealing, like I said, with dry bladder situations. And like I said, and then we kind of talked about earlier is if we do have a requirement for a direct observed test. Direct observed tests, why would we be doing direct observed? Is we talked about before is, yes, if the collector finds things that are suspected adulteration, substitution during the collection process, or even walking into that collection process and we see somebody acting like they are trying to conceal something, that would be a reason to do a direct observed test. Other reasons to do a direct observed test is the employer ordered a direct observed test being done. Sometimes that was because the medical review officer, they had a previous test that the medical review officer said that this is going to be recollected, but it will be recollected under direct observation.
Right.
Because of unusual results from an original specimen. And there are certain times, such as return to duty and follow-up testing, that the DOT mandates that those tests be directly observed. So, as I said earlier, that there is a procedure, that, they are going to have to raise their shirt, drop their drawers, underwear, spin around one time. The collector is going to do that direct observation. If the donor does not allow for a direct observation to be done, that will be considered a refusal to test. If we catch when they were, raising their shirt or dropping their trowel, and we find a device on them, we will stop that collection right away. That will be, confiscate whatever we found. And we will, and that will get reported as a refusal to test. And I said there's implications, to that. And I will tell you, we have in our offices trophy drawers of devices that we catch. We've confiscated off of donors on a regular basis.
Right.
Of all these wonderful little things that they have tried to bring in to try to cheat on the tests. And, it's, when we're finding suspected things, especially, out of temperatures or smell, unusual smells, and if the donor does allow for that recollection to be done under direct observation, it's very rare that they do not test positive on that test.
Right.
We're pretty, our collectors are usually pretty dead on, because they're usually pretty confident, that they need to do it, because they rather not have to do a direct observed test. It's not the most glamorous and fun thing to do in the world.
Exactly. I think one thing too, just to point out, in this collection process and on the chain of custody forms, there is a remarks section, and the collector has an obligation to provide information in that remarks section about a first attempt was made, or, the original specimen had an unusual color or odor. They're defining the reason that either a shy bladder procedure was implemented, or an additional test was required for under direct observation. They are making those remarks on the chain of custody for a couple of reasons. One, it helps them remember each collection situation, but it also provides the employer, the medical review officer, others to know what transpired through that collection process. And it's important that that type of information is included on the chain of custody, so that educated decisions can be made by a DER or others of how to proceed with a test and its subsequent result.
When the results come back from the laboratory, labs report results. Besides, they'll report negatives, they report positive results. But there's also a few other types of test results that we do get. And from a DER situation, you kind of need to know what some of these are and what some of them mean. We have, sometimes we get a report from the laboratory. It's a canceled test. A canceled test is a drug or alcohol test that has a problem identified that cannot be or has not been corrected, which is, this part otherwise requires to be canceled. A canceled test is neither a positive nor a negative test. Examples of a canceled test may be that there was an affidavit that did not get returned. During the laboratory process, they were not able to, where we said that there is a control specimen, and if they could not on multiple attempts get that test to show that where the control was coming back properly, there's times that they have they have to cancel that test, or they are canceling a test because they did find an error in that, in the chain of custody process that did require
that fatal flaw.
The next thing is sometimes we get results that say they are a dilute specimen. A dilute specimen is a urine specimen with a creatine or specific gravity values that are lower than expected for human urine. So we are, the laboratory is doing some controls, not just looking for the drugs, but they are looking, is this actually human urine, and is it that we are producing urine that is where somebody may have tried to flush out their system either with too much fluids in too short a period of time, or they try to take some type of masking agent that all it did was basically where the person's in effect is really just peeing out urine, because we are, peeing out water, that it is just flushing out their system where so much, fluids in too short a period of time that, we're not actually able to see what is, if the metabolites of a drug really are present or not, because it's just too, as I said,
too diluted.
Down. So they do check for a certain level, level of creatine and specific gravity, which is really the acidity of that specimen, to see, yes, is this both human, and is this, and is there enough in there that shows that we do have a valid specimen, which then kind of gets us into invalid results. An invalid result is a result reported by the Department of Health and Human Services certified laboratory in accordance with the criteria established by, their department when a positive, negative, or adulterated or substituted result cannot be established for a specific drug or specimen, validity testing. Sometimes we just get an unusual result, and it could be because somebody took some type of masking agent. They took some other substance that was in an attempt to maybe adulterate that sample, that we cannot actually get a definitive reason that it was, that one, it was human urine, or that, that there really was a drug present because there was something in there that was giving the laboratory unusual readings that was not in accordance with
what a typical urine specimen would have.
And then there's times that a specimen is just rejected for testing. And that's when no tests were performed for a specimen because the fatal flaw or critical flaw is not completed. So they didn't even try to attempt to to even run that test because there was a breach in that chain of custody from the get-go that they detected that was going to prohibit them from, establishing that chain of custody was valid.
Right. So to wrap up today, we've touched a lot on that collection process and really, dug deep into the 25 steps that have been laid out by the government of how to provide a proper specimen collection. And we went kind of through step by step and really outlined all the places where the employer, the donor, and the collector all have responsibilities to make sure that the chain of custody of that specimen are held true to make sure that a valid test and test result can be completed.
And it is looking at how important that collector position is because, as we said from the get-go, that when a test gets canceled due to a breach in the chain of custody process, chances are the majority, 90-some% of the time, that error that was made, that omission that was made, was in the collection process.
Right.
So if there's going to be a legal challenge to a test, chances are it was not that they're challenging the laboratory process. It was not that they are challenging what the medical review officer's findings were. If they are trying to challenge it, it's because there was a breach in those 25 steps that collector did.
Right.
So it is, make sure you know who, I'm a DR, make sure you know your collection sites. Make sure you know what these processes are, that you do have the ability to audit your sites and make sure that, your vendors that you are using, your service providers, are doing things in accordance to protect you as the employer.
Exactly. That is critical, and employers really do need to know what that process is because at the end of the day, they are making decisions on their employees or potential employees based on the integrity of that drug test process and result. So I want to thank everybody for listening today, and we will talk to you next time.